Part 2 of Unit 5 addresses industrialization. 19th century urbanization primarily occurred as a result of industrialization. Americans and immigrants sought jobs in textile, oil, steel, and railroad industries. Industrialization initially started on the East Coast, but oil production and railroad construction drew Americans west. Industrialization began in the early 19th century and continued well into the 20th century. It occurred in two major waves. In the early 19th century, textiles and leather manufactured in factories drove the economy. In the late 19th century, oil, steel, and railroad industries thrived. By the early 19 teens and 20s, it was in the realm of consumer goods that factories thrived. Over the course of the 19th and into the 20th centuries, production methods changed significantly. The mechanization of production transformed working conditions and living conditions for laborers. Before the second and late 19th century wave of industrialization, a variety of production methods existed. They varied greatly and will be discussed in the next several slides. Initially, Americans labored in small at-home workshops where they produced goods using simple hand tools. Farmers tilled their fields using simple plows powered by horses. These early methods limited the amount of goods produced as well as the size of the markets. They also tended to keep profits small. Those Americans who possessed or wished to learn a skill belonged to and labored in a guild. Each craft was organized into a separate guild: the butcher, the baker, the milliner, the carpenter, etc. Guilds created skilled laborers and produced custom-made goods. Here you see the basic guild structure. Usually, a young male began as an apprentice and remained in this entry-level position for several years. He learned a craft from the bottom up and lived in accommodations provided by his employer. In exchange for his labor, he received room, board, and learned a skill. As one honed one's craft, one moved up in the guild's structure and became a journeyman. In medieval Europe, where the guild system originated, the laborer journeyed from shop to shop, improving his skills and earning money, hence the term journeyman. The ultimate goal of the journeyman was to master his craft and to open his own shop. The guild system was highly self-regulatory. Masters regulated membership, quantity, and the quality of a product. Masters did not want too many apprentices being employed in any given year. This would mean too much competition in the future. They regulated the quantity. They didn't want to produce a surplus of goods that no one would purchase. If these goods sat in their workshop, they would have to reduce the price, and this would mean a loss of profits. They also regulated the quality of a product. A master took pride in the products produced from his shop. He knew that his livelihood and reputation depended upon the quality of the good produced. He also relied on the word of mouth of a satisfied consumer. Skilled labor, local markets, and men characterized the guild system. A second method of early 19th century production was referred to as the putting out system or cottage industry. It was called the putting out system because usually a middleman from the city put out or supplied raw materials to rural families in the countryside. Families divided labor according to skill. Usually it was the child who had the least skilled task, culminating in the hardest task performed by the oldest male, usually the father. These farm families labored in their off-season to supplement their income. In the spring, the middleman would return to collect the finished goods and pay the family per piece. The goal then, ultimately, to make as much profit as possible, was to make as many goods. While the putting out system served its purpose during the early days of American production, it proved to be inefficient. Middlemen were forced to travel from farm to farm collecting finished work from rural farm families. The family labor system couldn't meet the consumer needs of a growing urban population. It made more sense to bring labor to a single site of production, where goods could be mass-produced by machine. This led to the rise of factories and to factory towns in the early to mid-19th century. It was in the countryside that many of these factories began. That was because the labor source, as well as the energy sources, water and coal, were located in the countryside. Labor and resources were centralized into a single factory. However, the increasing number of labor, the use of technology, and the need to harness these resources required more control over all of these things. Managers and supervisors arose as a consequence. Conditions in these early factories were indeed poor. Lighting was poor, technology was fast, conditions of labor were unregulated. The pace was quick, the hours were long, and the pay was low. As a consequence, Francis Cabot Lowell re-envisioned production. He traveled to England to observe industrial and working conditions which had existed for decades. When he returned to America, he envisioned setting up a more humane factory, one in which there would be cleaner, safer conditions for the employees. He also envisioned harnessing a new labor source, single women. These single women would be housed in company dorms and provided with decent living conditions. In their off time, they would attend schools and become educated. On Sundays, they would attend church. He would also pay these single women higher wages. Lowell died before actualizing his vision, but his Boston associates set up the Lowell factory in Massachusetts. It worked temporarily. However, ultimately, the Lowell system could be labeled a failed experiment. By the 1830s and 40s, the Irish arrived in great numbers. Rival factories employed the Irish for low wages. This drove the wages of the single women at the Lowell factory down and eventually led to changes and transformation in the factory itself. In the 1840s and 50s, industrialization continued, but by the 1860s, innovation slowed as a consequence of the Civil War. After the Civil War, America experienced its second and larger industrial revolution. Three major industries arose that fueled economic growth and which reconfigured production methods. These industries included oil, steel, and the railroad. While founded separately and existing independently at first, eventually their founders worked collaboratively to modernize American production. Often these corporations merged and formed trusts, which were run by a board of directors. The board worked to maximize the profits and to increase the power of each of the member companies. By 1900, Americans began to witness the rise of corporate capitalism and of corporate monopolies. J.D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil and created one of America's first monopolies. As American production and industry modernized, companies increasingly relied on and grew more dependent upon oil. Initially, the oil refining industry proved very competitive. However, soon Standard Oil reduced the price of its oil, making it difficult for smaller and other companies to compete. Then Rockefeller purchased the struggling companies and horizontally integrated them into his own. As a result, Rockefeller eliminated much of Standard Oil's competition and monopolized 90% of the oil refining business. Having done so, Standard Oil could raise its prices beyond market value and profit handsomely. Another pioneer of American industry was Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie opened up Carnegie Steel in Pittsburgh. Steel was used in the construction of railroad lines, bridges, and skyscrapers. Hence, the demand for steel in late 19th and early 20th century American cities and out west increased dramatically. Andrew Carnegie was an unlikely pioneer of industry. He was born in Scotland in tremendous poverty. Like many of those who arrived in the 1830s and 40s, he emigrated in the hopes of finding a better life in America. He came to Pittsburgh with his family in 1848, where his aunt lives, and founded Carnegie Steel. Andrew Carnegie started working at an early age as a bobbin boy in a textile industry, but his hard work and his ambition led to his rapid promotion in the textile industry. Eventually, he moved on and worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad. Here he was mentored by Thomas Scott, the president of the railroad. Thomas Scott not only gave him advice, but financial assistance used to start Carnegie's Steel. Scott advised Carnegie to avoid strikes and to run his factory 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Carnegie took this advice to heart. Unlike Rockefeller, who focused on consolidating a single industry, Carnegie vertically integrated his steel industry into that of related industries. Steel needed ore from mines out west to be produced. The ore had to be shipped to the factory on railroad lines owned by someone else. Once manufactured, it then had to be distributed by other railroad companies. Rather than pay the mining companies and the railroad to extract and ship and then distribute the finished product, Carnegie bought up these industries. The startup costs and the risks were great, but the wealth that could be accumulated as a result were tremendous. Here you can see an example of vertical integration and how Carnegie Steel fit into it. Carnegie's use of vertical integration redefined the scale of production in the United States. It made Carnegie not only a pioneer of industry, but one of the wealthiest human beings who's ever lived. Carnegie's life story, from an impoverished Irish immigrant to a wealthy and powerful American entrepreneur, inspired hard-working Americans for generations. His success story also fueled a belief in the American dream, the notion that if one works hard and has ambition, one can go from poverty to wealth, from rags to riches. Americans longed to understand how they too could succeed. As a result, Andrew Carnegie in the 1880s wrote The Gospel of Wealth and lectured on the sources of his financial success. In The Gospel of Wealth, he promoted the following: every laborer should start at the bottom. By starting at the bottom and at the beginning of an industry, and by working one's way up like he had, one could truly understand the nature of that industry and more effectively manage it. Secondly, have dreams, and don't just be the employee in your dream, but be the king in your dreams. In other words, have ambition. The bottom line, however, was hard work. The only means by which one could achieve success was through hard work. He had done so, and he advised a generation of Americans to do the same. At the end of the 19th century, with increased drinking and eventually the rise of temperance and prohibition, which we'll discuss later, Carnegie also advised not drinking. Drinking wasted money and precious time that could be used to invest in a business and to nurture it. Carnegie advised prudent investment. He also discouraged Americans from wild speculation. He did not respect business moguls who inherited their family's wealth and companies, but who did not understand the value of hard work nor the nature of the company that they ran. Ultimately, Carnegie's philosophy of success was that of self-help. In other words, one shouldn't look for a handout or government assistance to succeed, nor for an excuse to explain one's failure. Instead, success was the responsibility of the individual. If one succeeded, he or she could be proud. If he or she failed, it was ultimately the fault of that individual. No one or thing could be blamed. A generation of Americans embraced this self-help philosophy. So too did President Herbert Hoover in 1929, who used it to combat the Great Depression, but with less success than Andrew Carnegie. Another important Carnegie dimension was his philanthropy. While he made millions of dollars, he gave most of it away. He built libraries such as that in Chico on Salem Street, concert halls, and hospitals. Give a helping hand, not a handout, was Andrew Carnegie's legacy. Bill Gates follows in the footsteps of Andrew Carnegie as an American businessman and philanthropist. The third industry responsible for modernizing late 19th century America was that of the railroad. In an earlier lecture, in Unit 3, I discussed the early 19th century transportation revolution and how by the 1830s short railroad lines were being constructed on the East Coast. Because of westward migration and settlement that occurred by the 1860s, America needed a railroad line that could connect the East and the West Coast and goods with consumers. This railroad line is known as the Transcontinental Railroad, which you see here. It consisted primarily of two lines, the Union Pacific Line and the Central Pacific Line. Both eventually connected in Promontory Point, Utah, in May 10th of 1869. The railroad started in 1866 and was completed nearly 3 years later. As stated earlier, there were two primary railroad lines, the Union Pacific, which started in Omaha, Nebraska. It moved west and covered nearly 1,100 miles. The Central Pacific Line started in Sacramento, California, and moved east and covered approximately 700 miles. The Union Pacific had the easier task. It had to basically build over flat land. The Union Pacific Railroad employed the newly arriving Irish, who would work hard and for cheap wages. The Central Pacific Line employed the Chinese, who had been in California since the 1840s. They had the harder task, as they had to drill through the Sierra Nevada and blast through it with dynamite. The work was dangerous. This Central Pacific Line was funded by the Big Four. These are pioneers in California history. Crocker, Huntington, Stanford, and Hopkins comprised the Big Four. They pooled their private funds and resources to help create this railroad line. They were given government incentives of land as compensation for funding this railroad. Consequently, railroad became the second largest landholder in the United States in the 19th century. The union of these two railroad lines occurred on May 10, 1869, at Promontory Point, Utah. The results were many. Americans now had a faster, easier way to transport goods and people cheaper and faster across the nation. The age of traveling in the covered wagon quickly ended. A second area of impact occurred in the beef industry. You may have heard the slogan recently used by the beef industry in its TV commercial, "Beef is what's for dinner." This one, America began to consume lots of meat. The Transcontinental Railroad gave rise to the cattle ranching industry and the need for the cowboy who would drive the cattle from pasture to pasture. The profitability of beef fueled the cattle rustling industry and the need to brand cattle. Finally, the cattle car used by railroads allowed cattle to be transported across the Great Plains to the slaughterhouses of Chicago and Green Bay. The growth of the railroad also led to the settlement of the Great Plains and to the rise of towns like Deadwood, Reno, and Denver. As American settlers and the railroad moved out west, they oftentimes found themselves in conflict with the many buffalo that roamed the Great Plains, and with the Native Americans who had been given land on the Great Plains when Americans had perceived the territory as a great American desert. The late 19th century resulted in the demise of the buffalo and the restriction of Native Americans to reservations in places like the Dakotas. The growth of the railroad also fueled the complaints of small farmers residing on the Great Plains. While big corporations were given breaks by the railroad, the small farmer almost felt that he was being discriminated against. Consequently, farmers would unite into what became known as the Farmers Alliance and eventually the Populist Party by 1892, in an attempt to curtail the growth of the corporate railroad. The growth of the railroad also stimulated the U.S. domestic economy. Markets became linked as a consequence of the railroad. Railroads could now transport goods from the East Coast as far as to the West Coast of California. California oranges could be shipped to the Midwest, to the East Coast, and as far as overseas. America's economy began to grow as a result of these three industries. While businesses and corporations thrive, the working and living conditions of American laborers suffered and actually declined. In the factories, the mines, and on the railroad, American laborers worked very long hours, oftentimes double of what we currently do. It was not uncommon to work 12 to 14, even 16 hours per day. Minimum wage did not exist at this time. The wages often tended to be low and based upon one's age, gender, and skill. Children were frequently employed because of their low or no skill. Consequently, employers could justify very low wages for these individuals. The same was true of women. It was not until 1935 when FDR, as a consequence of the Great Depression, established a minimum wage. Currently, the minimum wage is being debated. The working conditions for most American laborers were poor. Poor lighting and ventilation were typical in the factories on the East Coast in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. Factories weren't regulated by the federal government or the state governments in the late 19th century. Fire exits and sprinklers were not required in factories. So when the fire broke out in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City in March 1911, workers who tried to flee found fire escape doors nailed shut. Many died as a result of smoke inhalation or jumped to their deaths through the open windows. Mine disasters were not uncommon. In addition to these problems, laborers who did suffer from ailments caused by the job faced a life of trying to provide for themselves. There was no health or accident insurance. If one did get injured on the job, one had to rely on the charity of others or upon other family members who were working at the time. In the late 19th, early 20th century, the American economy also experienced booms and busts. During booms, American factories couldn't find enough labor to work in the factories. But in bust cycles, many individuals were laid off, oftentimes for months at a time, with nothing on which to live. This proved to be very problematic for many Americans for decades. Life at home wasn't much better than that in the factories. At the turn of the century, most urban wage laborers lived in tenement housing. Tenement housing were multi-storied, densely packed, one-room wide apartments. The buildings were host to multiple families. It wasn't unusual for a family of 6 to 8 people to live in the 3-room tenement apartment. Initially, studies show that these apartment buildings were poorly ventilated and poorly lit. One turn of the century study done showed that the temperature in these tenement apartments in New York City in the summer were as high as 115. They served as breeding grounds for disease and misery. They also served as second work sites. Initially, a family not only lived in a tenement apartment, but also worked and employed workers in their tenement apartments. This is in New York City, where the garment industry started in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Eventually, the garment industry would move uptown, and these apartments would be used solely as residences. As a consequence of such poor living conditions, it's easy to see why vaudevilles and taverns and community parks and events provided escape for the working class in urban sites. These are things we've talked about. At parades and community events, it wasn't uncommon to hear bands performing patriotic or military marches. The king of the marches was John Philip Sousa. John Philip Sousa ran away as a young boy to join the circus. At the turn of the century, the circus offered excitement and adventure that small towns could not provide. As a result of this, Sousa's father enlisted Sousa in the Marines for discipline. While in the Marines, John Philip Sousa led the Marine Marching Band. After he left the Marines, he headed his own band. He produced some of the most famous and well-known military and patriotic marches in American history. It's not uncommon on the 4th of July, as the fireworks are exploding, to hear, accompanying this explosion and the celebration, the Stars and Stripes Forever. He also wrote the Washington March and Semper Fidelis. Military music was popular as a consequence of the Civil War. Afterwards, it was performed at parades and community events, and on community bandstands. It was also performed at halftime shows during football games at the turn of the century. Marches would eventually contribute to rag, another musical genre that I'll discuss later on.